Welcome back to the Data Privacy Imperative Safeguarding Sensitive Data here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Our guests today are Frank Konechny, the Chief Technology Officer in the Office of Information Dominance and CIO in the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force. Kimberly Williams, Chief Strategist for the Public Sector at Informatica. Richard Spires, former CIO of the Homeland Security Department, and Andy Batten, the Director of the Office of Information Collection at the EPA. And I'm Tom Temin, your host. And we were speaking in the first segment about the proliferation of data and the location of data and the governance of data. Let's talk about actually protecting it now and making sure it's secure and free of privacy violations. And what I've noticed in the last few years is a change and a shift in approach from the firewall system surrounding approach to cybersecurity to one that seems to focus more on the data itself, regardless of platform, partly because of cloud, partly because of virtualization and the movement of data in that way. So is that a fair way to look at it, and how has that affected best practices toward handling cybersecurity? Frank, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, we've changed the focus to more data-centric as opposed to network-centric. In fact, we're trying to do a holistic viewpoint of this. The concern with the data, of course, is exfiltration of the data, but also, in a tactical sense, is the changing of the data without us noticing it. That would cause various problems in the battlefield. So that's the concern. We've gone more towards a holistic viewpoint in terms of data access, data control. As I mentioned, we're trying to get to an attribute-based access control system, which would be dynamic in the sense that it would be based on the current attributes of the person, the airman that's trying to get access to that data. It would change dynamically. But on top of that, we're also doing application tagging in the network side. So we're whitelisting, if you will, various transaction flows in the network. So we are controlling where the application is going, as well as what transactions are being sent to the application. So we're trying to do it both ways, and holistically the network as well as the data side.
So it's a data at rest and also data in transit approach,
data
you might
at rest,
say.
Yes, and data at rest is always encrypted, as well as most of the encryption will occur at data in transit as well.
So if it's all encrypted, then the implication is even if there was a breach of the network perimeter, there wouldn't be anything for anyone to do anything with because it would all be encrypted?
That's correct.
Is that the theory?
Yes. There's also, when we actually track the application and tagging, we can do some deep packet inspection of only where it's going. And so we can restrict out where it's going, or if we get an unknown transaction coming in from an unknown source, that can be restricted out too. So we're trying to be more holistic as opposed to just saying it's all network-based, because we have too many violations of the network coming in. I mean, there's billions of things that come in, and most of them are rejected.
And Richard, like the Air Force, Homeland Security has lots of people doing lots of missions. Most of them are not in a building somewhere. And so what was the approach there, and how's that evolving?
Well, picking up on Frank's point, I mean, different terms, but essentially the same thing, this notion of tagging the data or having metadata on the data itself, right? And it's a very critical aspect of this today, to be able to control and do things with the data that you want done appropriately. And what I mean by that is this whole notion of a strong identity management capability. And this is, I think, part of the big issue we face right now is it's one thing to do identity management solutions within your own organization, but take a look at Homeland Security. If you're working with state and local governments and law enforcement and first responders, how do you appropriately identify them, right? And then how do you know what their roles really are and keep all of that current so that when they're accessing or trying to access particular data in a particular situation, okay, you can appropriately grant that access. I mean, that's where the state of the art of these tools is going, to be able to handle those kinds of solutions at scales for hundreds of thousands of users or even millions of users.
So, Kimberly, it sounds like a process of making the data be able to talk about itself, for lack of a better word, and also having the tools available to understand what the data is telling it in terms of how it's being used, who's using it, and where it's going.
Absolutely. At Informatica, we look at our best practice approach as being a discover, secure, monitor, remediate approach. We look at each of those functions as being critical to securing and making sure the data is private. Within the discover, as I mentioned before, we have to know where that data is, all the occurrences, so not just where it sits in production, but where it sits across the enterprise. We also need to be able to limit how much you see of that data at once. So that's kind of how you secure it. You need to make sure that if you're going to expose data because someone is authorized to use it, so first you say, what is the policy for which you have access to it? And then you have to look at governance around that and say, well, how many pieces of data should they be able to view at once? Because I think it's pretty common knowledge that if you have access to 3 pieces of personal information, then you can probably steal that person's identity. So you have to be able to secure it. We look at monitoring. If someone has access to that data, whether it be an authorized user or an unauthorized user, perhaps it's a DBA even making a copy of a data set, we need to be able to audit that, and then we need to be able to alert the necessary and appropriate people. And then finally, we look at the remediation. So as we go through and look at all of this data and we say, how many times has it been accessed? Have there been any problems? What new policies can we implement across the enterprise? So not a one-off approach, but an enterprise approach to data security to ensure that this doesn't happen and that we're constantly in that improvement cycle. And those are the best practices that you really have to employ.
And Andy, at the EPA, of course, the idea of someone changing data unbeknownst to the owners of the data, as Frank mentioned, could be a really big issue. No, I didn't do 10 parts per million. I really did 5 parts per million, whatever the case might be. And so what is your up-to-date approach for looking at data and data privacy now, given the age we're in and the fact that data is so portable?
I look at that as a 2-part question. The first being the changing of the data. Obviously, there's got to be a data stewards network. You understand who has the ability to change information and who are you going to empower with that. So whether it's a location of a facility that needs to change, there would be a process by which we identify the individual who is submitting that change of information and making sure that the change is appropriate. And that's something we want to work on with our co-regulators because in a state or tribe, they're going to be closest to the actual facility. Other things that we're, I think, going to face in the future with respect to the information as we move from just the perimeter, the firewalling of data, the issue of tagging that was mentioned by the other panelists, marking that data. That we all have spoken in various languages of marking, whether it's confidential business information or top secret or for your eyes only. In the future, having a consistent vocabulary so that we could mark things in a common language across the federal government and with our partners, and then being able to apply access controls on a known vocabulary or a known set of markings is going to become important. But initially, we just have to get to a point where we are speaking that same language when it comes to tagging and marking.
So it sounds like the Office of Information Collection, which is a distinct entity at EPA, you don't see that at every agency. What are you primarily concerned with in the office? Is it the security of the collection and the integrity of it?
Primarily the integrity to start with. Certainly our first responsibility is information exchange with our co-regulators. We are also responsible for records management, privacy, Freedom of Information Act, so we are providing information to requesters of that information. And then to the public, making information that is making it freely accessible when it's appropriate and not creating unnecessary barriers. So we do have a full life cycle of receiving that information, making sure that it's available for or handled properly for special programs, whether, again, it's privacy or records, but also not creating unnecessary barriers for the public who should be able to access this information freely.
Okay, the federal government has no shortage of standards and laws that govern a lot of things related to data and security. We have HIPAA, which covers, of course, health information. NIST, as an organization, has published thousands of pages of guidance and not so much regulations, but standards and definitions for every tiny aspect of the whole data question. And we have the FISMA law, which is much maligned, but it has caused agencies over the years to at least make sure they have some regular examination of their security. But everyone says they don't do enough. So how far do those laws and sets of definitions and guidelines really go? And where do they leave off that agencies have to pick up and do for themselves? Richard?
Well, I would first say that, they do a lot. And I know they tend to get maligned. But the fact of the matter is, like, for instance, in this guidance, I think there's some excellent guidance. But if you look at this stuff, it's all like FISMA, it's all risk-based, right? So it's really still up to the agency to decide, okay, system by system or data set by data set, okay, how that data should be protected, using their guidelines as, if you will, a way to go about it, but it's still, where do you draw those lines? Okay, how far do you want to go to protect certain data sets based on a risk-based decision? And that's the way I think it should be. No issue with that. But I go back to the complexity factor we talked about earlier, which is just that there is so much data and it's so dispersed that I think that's where the real issues lie today. It's getting your arms around the data. That's the bigger problem, if you will, than the standards issues that we face at this point.
So the standards don't really give you operational guidance. That depends on your situation and what you have to do.
Yes, that's correct.
And Frank, what about at the Air Force? I mean, there's DoD standards and definitions that are separate from all the ones that the civilian agencies have.
Right. There's DoD policy about PII and about HIPAA. PII is actually more restrictive than HIPAA in some senses. Everybody's going to, for FSMA, we're going to a risk management framework using the standards. And we're trying to get it standard across all of DoD because of reciprocity issues. Because usually when the DAA comes for each system and each service, they have a slightly different viewpoint of what is correct security for that particular application or that data set. So we're trying to across the board, figure out what should be that risk management framework for same pieces of data across the board.
So it sounds like you almost need an engine of security to make these decisions in real time.
At times, yes. And that's why reciprocity is so important now. As DoD becomes more of an enterprise as opposed to an individual service organization, they're going to go to the point where we're saying, well, if I build a system and I put it into the enterprise, everybody is going to be vulnerable at some point in time because it's all connected. So therefore, reciprocity and standardization of what we mean by risk management framework is becoming more and more important.
So standardizing on the standards and then deriving operations out of that.
Yes, sir.
All right, and Kimberly, for people that are helping the government as contractors and suppliers of technology, those guidelines and definitions, the NIST and the FSMA and the HIPAA, are they just something that you check off to say, yeah, we got that? Or do they really guide product strategies, and how do you bake it all in together?
Well, certainly I think they do guide our product strategy because we really look beyond just those standards and say, what is really the problem and how do we address it? If you look at HIPAA or FSMA, there's requirements and we meet those within the products. But we also look beyond that and say, there's retention policies. There's FOIA requests that also have to be considered in that. There's certainly agency-specific policies. If you look at a technology like encryption, certainly valid, it protects data, but it doesn't allow you to have a policy-driven approach to protecting that data. So if you can retain something for 5 years, after that, you need to have a policy that says right there on the data that cannot be released. Or if you have a FOIA request and you want to make sure that data never is part of that FOIA request, if you can include that in the policy and have a technology that supports that policy, which is very important. That's where we're going. We're not saying it's enough to secure it. We're saying we have to meet the basic regulations, but then provide agencies the ability to have even more capabilities beyond that.
So the metadata that might be associated with a particular set might also include information about what you have to do with it and what its life cycle handling requirements are.
You can do it at the metadata level, or we believe that you can put that in the technology solution as well, and you can actually secure the data using the technology. The metadata is important to understand which pieces are sensitive so that you can enact that policy.
But my question was, can that capability be part of the data itself along with the metadata?
Yes, absolutely.
Not part of the application necessarily, but part of the data itself. So if that data moves to some other environment completely with another application, if there's interoperability, then that data would be similarly protected when it goes.
Absolutely. And in fact, we would believe that you shouldn't do it at the application level. This should always be about the data. So it doesn't matter if you've copied it from production to test. It doesn't matter if you've moved it to the cloud. It doesn't matter if you're doing it from a report rather than the application. How many times do you run a query rather than go through your application? It always needs to be secured.
Okay, and Andy, so that's a lot to chew on for the EPA. And what's your approach?
Well, with respect to the FSMA and other guidances that are out there, the one that I'd like to point out is the Privacy Act of 1974. And a lot of what we do in the privacy world when we initially look at systems is we conduct a privacy impact assessment. And we're looking at a single system to see if the information that's retrieved is retrieved based on a piece of privacy information, such as a name or an address or a phone number, let alone sensitive privacy information like your bank account number or something like that. The problem is, in this day and age, and why we need to take another look at the Privacy Act of 74, is when you're looking at information sharing and the ability to combine information, you're not necessarily looking at that individual system and how it retrieved information off a personal identifying piece of information, but you're looking at the combination effect and how people may be putting different sources of information together. And I think that may be one of the things we need to look at as we go forward. What do we need to do to advance what the intent is of the 74 Privacy Act?
So you almost need to put data all through a filter. Is not a great word, but some way of optimizing or equalizing what the data says about itself and the way it reacts to applications, no matter what the source, so that it comes out being able to be interoperable in terms of privacy and protection at the other end.
Well, we're looking at technologies and solutions where you'd actually have automated business rules to be able to assess the metadata, the data itself, within the context of the situation as to whether you're going to grant access. And that would take into account things like privacy issues, civil liberties issues. And I think that's where you need to go in order to address these very actually complex issues when you start combining data.
All right, our guest today, Frank Konechny. He's the Chief Technology Officer in the Office of Information Dominance and Chief Information Officer in the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force. Andy Batten, the Director of the Office of Information Collection at EPA. Richard Spires, the former CIO of the Homeland Security Department, and Kimberly Williams, Chief Strategist for the Public Sector at Informatica. I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to the Data Privacy Imperative, Safeguarding Sensitive Data, here on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM.